This video is a part of Project France, which is like a whole thing. A bunch of us famous, successful, and staggeringly wealthy history tubers have an exclusive group chat where we talk shit about you and laugh at all of your stupid comments. This month, a bunch of us decided to get together and make videos about French history, which is in a big playlist which should be flashing across your screen somewhere right now. The political relationship between revolutionary France and revolutionary America was complicated, sometimes friendly, sometimes fraught. It was no different on the ground, where these two cultures lived side by side. And of course, the embodiment of that cultural cosmopolitanism in early America was beautiful New Orleans, Louisiana. American immigration to Louisiana was limited during the colonial period, but Anglophones still made up a significant minority of New Orleans' population. The French and Spanish Creole locals seemed to divide these Americans into two very distinct categories. First, the elites, slave traders, lawyers, and merchants, they were referred to as Anglo-American, whereas the more working class, boatmen, sailors, and tradesmen were referred to as Kaintucks, as in Kentucky. But you didn't have to be from Kentucky to be called a Kaintuck. It really just referred to the fact that a lot of Americans arrived in New Orleans from up north via the river trade. And it carried this connotation that you were boorish and unrefined. After the Louisiana Purchase, President Jefferson incorporated New Orleans into the territory of Orleans. And Americans started to flock to New Orleans to make their fortunes on the frontier. In many ways, the complex relationship between these newcomers and the established French and Spanish Creole locals would characterize the history of the city for decades to come. If you've ever taken a ghost tour down here, then you've probably heard that we call medians the neutral ground, because way back in the day, the median of Canal Street used to be the dividing line between the French neighborhood of the Vieux Carré, otherwise known as the French Quarter, and the American neighborhood of Faubourg Saint Mary, today the Central Business District. But the truth is, while many Americans did settle upriver of Canal Street, these neighborhoods were not segregated by language or culture. A lot of wealthy Americans actually had townhouses in the quarter, and Franco-American economic and political interests were much more mutually aligned than local legend would suggest. In most pre-industrial cities, the wealthy lived in these elegant city centers, while the poor and the working class were relegated to the suburbs and the fringes. It was no different in early American New Orleans. Well-to-do Anglo-Americans were firmly in the social and commercial orbit of the Creole planter elite, and probably didn't give their poor Kaintuck countrymen a second glance when passing him in the street. Similarly, the Creole planters in and around New Orleans had very little in common culturally with the rural residents of Francophone Louisiana. And even recent French migrants, they really didn't have much in common with at all. It seems to me that even though there was significant sort of cultural clashing in early American New Orleans, those sort of cultural differences have gone over-exaggerated, while class differences maybe have gone underappreciated. See, most of these Creole elites were of aristocratic stock originally, and as such had been deeply suspicious of Napoleon and of revolutionary France, especially given Napoleon's original plans for the Louisiana colony.
France sold Louisiana for a lot of reasons. It really wasn't some random purchase. Napoleon reacquired the territory in 1800 and intended to launch a new French empire from it. But he failed to conquer Haiti in 1803, and so he decided that there was no more use for the Louisiana colony. The US had actually supported Haiti a year prior to Napoleon even getting the territory as part of a naval conflict between France and the US called the Quasi-War. It was part of this larger cosmopolitan exchange that was happening across the Atlantic with these bourgeois revolutions, where France and America influenced each other and overthrew their kings. Resultant from that relationship, the US and France went between being friends to enemies to, I guess you could call a more cordial relationship. These diplomatic and intellectual interactions were where Enlightenment ideology met reality, ultimately developing into the Louisiana Purchase. That cosmopolitan exchange is what I'm talking about over on my channel as part of Project France. So be sure to come check that out.
By 1810, a significant number of French Creoles in New Orleans were slave-owning refugees from Haiti, and as such had an extremely dim view of the universal rights of man. So, by and large, they actually welcomed the American takeover. But while the Creole elite imagined taking a leading political role in this new Louisiana, Anglo-Americans weren't about to relinquish the reins of power. In a classic example of the pot calling the kettle black, wealthy Anglos often criticized the Creole planters for their opulent lifestyles. Plantation owner Jean-Noel expressed bewilderment at this characterization.
We could not imagine what has produced this idea of our effeminacy and profusion, and the laborious planter at his frugal meal, urged with a smile of bitterness and complaints at descriptions published at Washington of his opulence and luxury.
This sounds incredibly ironic to modern ears, because of course, Destrehan wasn't the one doing the planting. But Anglo-Americans wouldn't have even thought of that retort, because if there was one thing that the Americans and the Creoles unquestionably agreed on, it was their commitment to white supremacy. Before the Civil War, New Orleans had the largest and most prosperous population of free people of color anywhere in North America. Favorable legislation during the Spanish colonial period had given these free blacks unprecedented agency. At least in theory, they had full property rights, including to, buy or own or sell slaves. They could engage in business contracts. They could even bring civil suits against whites. But during the early American period, these rights were methodically stripped away. This was not a sinister plot by mustache-twirling Americans to destroy the freedom-loving egalitarian culture of French Louisiana, as is sometimes portrayed. Remember, French Creoles were just as thoroughly invested in white supremacy as the Americans were. Rather, it was part of an overall reactionary trend by powerful whites across North America to consolidate their power and influence in places where white people were more often than not an ethnic minority. This was largely due to the seismic aftershocks of the Haitian Revolution, a wildly successful slave revolt that proved that organized blacks could overthrow their white masters on a huge scale. Servile insurrection quickly became the worst nightmare of all slaveholding elites, whether French or American. And free blacks, though they were also more often than not very invested in slavery, were disturbingly politically active. From the perspective of white elites, this was dangerous and had to end immediately. So in the years after Louisiana became American, Territorial Governor William C.C. Claiborne passed legislation, with the full cooperation of white Creoles, that limited the movements of free blacks within Louisiana and required them to carry their free papers at all times. This was a profound insult to many free blacks, a lot of whom had never been slaves before in their lives. Some of them were even mixed race enough to pass for white. Across North America, laws were also passed that made manumission of slaves more difficult and expensive. During the French and Spanish colonial periods in New Orleans, it wasn't that unusual for people to free their slaves on occasion. That's what created the class of free people of color in the first place. But now, virtually any chance of upward mobility for slaves was gone. And of course, white fears of servile insurrection were entirely justified. In January 1811, 500 slaves of the German coast region, which is about 40 miles upriver, rose in rebellion and marched on the city. The force of American soldiers that were sent against them, they outmaneuvered. It would be the Creole planters, taking their own initiative to form a militia that would eventually defeat the rebels in a decisive battle. Francophone planters like Jean-Noel judged the surviving rebel leaders themselves in extra-legal trials, without American help and outside of the American system. They passed sentence themselves, executing their enemies and sticking their heads on poles. You'd think this would represent triumph for French Creole political interests, but it would ultimately be the Americans, like Governor Claiborne, who would benefit from the fallout of the 1811 revolt. Men like Destrehan may have done the dirty work, but Claiborne, he had the ear of the power brokers in Washington. In his reports to the federal government, he took credit for the victory and minimized the scale of the crisis. The revolt was a microcosm of Haiti, an attempted revolution. The Creole planters understood this. But Claiborne wrote the whole event off as an act of gross criminality. He understood that as the revolt was unfolding, Louisiana statehood was currently being debated on the floor of Congress. In his reports to his superiors, he made it very clear that Louisiana was safe and secure under a new American order. A little more than a year later, Louisiana officially joined the Union as the 18th state. French culture would continue to thrive on the Gulf Coast, but Anglo-American power was all but assured. Well, there goes SJW Atun-Shei, playing the race card again. It's supposed to be a nice, uncontroversial video of French history, a nice little collab. God, what do black people have to do with New Orleans history anyway? Nothing. Why can't you just talk about uncontroversial things like anybody else? Like, Hannibal or tanks. Tanks are good. Nobody ever gets offended about tanks. God, you're such a fucking hack. You fucking idiots. You fucking idiot. Can't believe you. God. Anyway, I'd like to give a shout out to my very generous patron, Sheridan's Reaver 13. It's a really great username. He wants me to tell you that each Dixie boy must understand that he must mind his Uncle Sam. So, Union Dixie, great tune. Great tune. Though, I gotta say, Confederate music, it just kind of doesn't, it doesn't for me more. I gotta say, I don't know, it's just better, you know? It's just better. Southern music is just better than Northern music. I'm sorry. Fucking sue me. Anyway, you know, give a like or don't, you know, I don't really care. Or comments, you know, or just don't, you know, I mean, I'm not gonna read them, at least not most of them. And definitely subscribe, which, I mean, honestly, you don't have to. I mean, I have 100,000, that's like enough, honestly, you know, like how greedy can you fucking get? Anyway. See you next time, folks.